This channel does not promote or encourage any illegal activities. All contents provided by this channel is meant for educational purpose only.
FTP Enumeration. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to utilize the various Metasploit Framework auxiliary modules to enumerate as much information as possible from FTP. So first and foremost, what is FTP? FTP stands for the File Transfer Protocol. This is a file transfer protocol that is typically hosted on port 21, and that of course is TCP, and is used to facilitate file sharing between a server and client or multiple clients. It is also frequently deployed or used as a means of transferring files to and from the directory of a web server. So if you've ever bought a domain name and set up a website, you know that you can utilize FTP to essentially transfer your website files to the server, and you can also do that vice versa, in that you can download files from the web server to your system, to your local system. And of course, in order for you to do this, you will need to authenticate to the FTP server. So FTP essentially handles authentication in the form of a username and password combination. So you log into the FTP server, you then provide a username and a password, and if successful, you'll get access to the FTP server and the directory that has been configured, and you can then download files from that particular directory, or you can upload files to it. You can again work and essentially transfer files between the FTP server and your local system. Now we can use multiple auxiliary modules to enumerate as much information as possible from the FTP service, and the type of information that we're after is typically the version of FTP that's running. Secondly, we can also perform a brute force attack on it to try and identify any username and password combinations that we can use to log in or authenticate to the FTP server. So we are going to be taking a look at various techniques and various modules that we can use to essentially enumerate as much information as possible from an FTP server. So let's get started with the lab. All right, so I'm back on the lab environment, and we can get started now. Firstly, first and foremost, by starting the PostgreSQL service. So we can actually do that by typing in service PostgreSQL start, right? Just to ensure that we can actually interact with the Metasploit Framework database. Once that is done, as you can see, everything's good on that front. We can now get the target IP. That can be done by typing in ifconfig, and of course we're looking for the Ethernet 1 interface, and we know that the target IP is always going to be the following IP address with a 3 instead of a 2. So again, we have copied that, and we can now start up the Metasploit Framework console, which I will do, and that should just take a few seconds to start up. After which we can begin creating our workspace, and then begin taking a look at the various modules that we can use. So first and foremost, we'll say workspace, add, and then we'll just call this FTP _ enum, right? And we are currently within that workspace. And again, we can confirm that by saying workspace. There we are. And let's get started. So the first module that we want to take a look at is the auxiliary module FTP version check, right? And which is essentially used to check for the version of FTP. However, let us perform a port scan to ensure that the target is in fact running FTP. So again, I'll just search for port scan. There we are. And we will be using the following module. So we'll use auxiliary scanner port scan TCP, which I'll just copy right over there. There we go. And we're going to say use, of course. So I'm going to say use. I paste that in, so it's currently active. I'll just get the target IP again, so I'll just copy that, make sure that I have it on hand. There we go, fantastic. We can now say show options, and then we're going to set the rhosts option, which is the target IP, and we're just going to type in the IP there, and of course remember to change the 2 to a 3. That is the target IP, and all we need to do is just hit run, because we know that FTP is on port 21, and that means that we don't have to increase the port range that's being scanned. And as you can see, immediately we're able to identify that FTP is actually open, so port 21 open. However, we don't know what service version is running, so we can't actually perform any vulnerability identification or anything like that. So in order to do this, what we're going to do is, let me just copy the IP there. just so that we have it on hand, we're just going to go back. And now we are going to search for FTP auxiliary modules, which again can be done by typing in search FTP. And in this case, you can see we have quite a few FTP modules here, and most of them look like they're exploits. And of course, we then have the auxiliary modules. If we want to limit the search results, what we can do is we can say search, and then we can specify the type here. And the type is going to be auxiliary. And then we can provide a name. So we can say name, FTP, we hit enter, and that's going to reduce the amount of results here that are going to be displayed. And we are primarily looking for the scanner auxiliary modules. And the one that we're interested in is this one right over here. So that is auxiliary scanner FTP version, and it essentially performs version scanning, which will allow us to detect what version of FTP is running, right? And we can then copy that, and we're going to say use, paste in the module name right over there, clear up the options. Let me just get the target IP, because again, I copied it to my previous clipboard, and we can now show the options for this particular module, show options. And what we need to provide is the target IP. The port has been configured to 21, which is perfectly fine. If you find a target that is running FTP on a different port, then you also need to change that. We don't need to provide the FTP user and password because we don't have them. And as you can see, they're not required under the required column. So we'll say set our hosts, paste in the IP, and of course, change the 2 to a 3, hit enter, and then hit run. And as you can see, it's able to detect the version of FTP that's running. And you can see it's Pro FTPD 1.3.5a. And of course, it gives you the other host information. So this is the FTP banner. Now, this information is very useful because we can use it to identify vulnerabilities for this specific version of Pro FTPD. So for example, if I say search Pro FTPD, right, and I hit enter, you can see that we can identify various exploits for Pro FTPD. However, this version of Pro FTPD is really not vulnerable to any particular exploit apart from this one here, which you can see. But in this case, we're not going to be using this because we're not at the exploitation phase. We're pretty much working with enumeration here. So that's the FTP version check module, and it's extremely helpful in identifying the exact version there. So we're just going to clear that out, and I'm going to go back a step, and we are going to take a look at the next FTP auxiliary module, which is the FTP brute force module, which essentially allows us to perform a brute force in order to identify the username and password. And of course, this will depend on the strength of the word list that you utilize. And in this case, I'm just going to search again for the module. So I'll use my previous command, search, the type is auxiliary, and the name is FTP. And the module that we're looking for is this one right over here, auxiliary scanner FTP login. As you can see, this is an FTP authentication scanner. So we're just going to copy it right over there, just get that information, and then paste that in there. And it's currently active. If we show the options that we need to set are going to be the rhosts option, which is the target IP address. The port is configured already, so our port is done. What we then need to provide is either a username that we want to test for or a user file that contains a list of usernames that we want to brute force. And we also need to provide a password file that again is essentially a series of passwords that we want to perform our brute force with. We can also change the brute force speed to, again, as you can see, it says how fast to brute force from 0 to 5, and it's currently set to 5. So again, based on the information you have, you can either provide a single password that you want to test or a single username. And in this case, we don't have any, so we're going to provide a user file and the password file. Now, the Metasploit framework comes with a really powerful or a really good list of word lists that we can utilize. However, before we do that, let's again paste in the IP here, the target IP. So I'll just copy that there, and we will say set our hosts. Paste in the IP there. Sorry, let's change that to a 3. There we go. And now what we want to do is, of course, set the user list, or rather the user file, and then the password file. So we're going to say set user file. and we then need to specify the location where the user file is stored. In this case, we will be utilizing one of the inbuilt Metasploit framework username lists, or user lists as it were, and this is found under the user share directory under the Metasploit framework folder, as we've already taken a look at when we were exploring the Metasploit framework architecture. We then want to head over into data, word lists, and we're looking for common usernames .txt. So that's the file that contains a list of usernames that we can use to perform the brute force attack. I'm going to hit enter. As you can see, that's been set successfully. We're now going to set the password file. So I'm just going to get rid of user here and change it to password file. So pass, set pass file, and instead of using common users, we're going to use Unix passwords, or the Unix passwords pass list. So Unix passwords.txt, hit enter, and it has set the password word list there. All right, excellent. So we have all the options configured. We can now hit run, and that is going to begin the brute force. Now, again, depending on the number of usernames and passwords within the user list and the password list, it's going to take time. So again, as you can see, it's going through each username and password combination. And when it actually has a match, it will be highlighted in green. And that's what I'm going to wait for. So I'm just going to let this perform the brute force. All right, so it looks like we were able to find a username and password combination that was successful, or that we can use to log into the FTP server, and the credentials are listed here. So sysadmin, and the password is this number combination, which is essentially 123456 in a reversed format. So what we can do is just terminate it here. Of course, you can let it run to see whether you will be able to identify any other usernames and passwords, and you can see it actually completed without finding any others. So these are the credentials that we'll be using. Now, in order to log into an FTP server, we will need to exit, or we actually can try and log in directly from the Metasploit framework console, but we need the target IP. So let me just copy that there. If I just show the options here, let me just show options. There we go, and we'll just copy the IP. What we can say is, let's see if we can log in. So FTP, and I'll try and open up the let's see if we can log in. There we are. Looks like we can actually interact with FTP. So I'm going to say FTP, and then we provide the target IP there. And we then want to copy the password. So we know that the username is sysadmin and the password is this combination of numbers. So we'll hit enter. And it's going to say service not available, remote server has closed connection. That is probably because of the brute force, and this is something that you need to keep into consideration, or that you need to keep in mind, is that a brute force can sometimes cause a service to actually be overwhelmed, or you can actually initiate a DDoS that again will take down the service. So you want to give that a few seconds. So while we're waiting for that to reset, what we can do is take a look at the other modules that we can use, or rather the final module that we'll be exploring. And in this case, the module name or the module that we'll be exploring is the anonymous login module, which will essentially check whether we can log in to the FTP server anonymously. So again, I'm just going to give this a few seconds. I'm just going to clear that out. There we are. And let's see if we can access that. I'm going to hit back. Let me just terminate there, and we can actually just exit here. So in order to use the FTP anonymous login module, again, we can essentially just say search, and then the type we can set to auxiliary, and then the name is going to be FTP, right? And we're looking for the module that allows us to log in. So this is the module here. So auxiliary scanner FTP anonymous. This will check for anonymous FTP access. So again, it'll actually detect and tell us whether we can use this. So we're just going to copy the module name here, and then paste it, and that should be active. So again, let me just get the IP here real quick, and we can just copy that and then show the options. There we go, and we can now again set the rhosts option, and again, we don't need to provide the username and password, although we'll take a look at how to authenticate in a few seconds. If we say set rhosts, and we paste in that and change that to a 3, and then hit run, It's going to run the module, and let's see whether the target FTP server is vulnerable to an anonymous FTP login. And as you can see, it is not, which again we expected. But in many cases, you always want to run this particular auxiliary module, as it can reveal, again, quite a bit of important information in regards to whether or not you can access the FTP server remotely, or rather anonymously. So now that we've done that, we can actually try and log in to the FTP server as I did previously. And I'm just going to say FTP, hit enter. And as you can see, it says we are connected, and it looks like we need to provide the username and password. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to exit from the Metasploit Framework console. So let me just exit. All right, so once exited, what we can say is FTP and then paste in the IP there, and then we'll be prompted to enter a username, which in this case we know is sysadmin, and then we know that the password is 654321. Hit enter, and it says it gives us a status code to 30, user sysadmin logged in, remote system type is Unix, so we know it's a Linux system, and then of course we can list out the contents of the directory. And you can see that we have a file here called secret.txt. So we can actually download this file onto our VM or onto our system by saying get secret.txt. And that is going to download it for us. As you can see, that transfer is complete. And now we can exit from the FTP server. And if we list out the contents of our directory, you can see we have the secret.txt file here. And we can cat out the contents of that file. And there you go. So again, FTP enumeration is extremely important, not only in identifying the service version, but also identifying potential exploits for that specific service version. As I said, or as I've mentioned, you can also perform an FTP brute force in order to see whether you can identify any username and password combination. If you're already able to identify a username, then the brute force might be more effective. And in our case, we were able to find a username and password combination that we actually used to log in. And as you can see, we were able to get a hold of some data. And in this case, the lab environment has been set up to show you that this can be quite dangerous. And again, as an attacker, this data, or we could have had access to the entire web server or any other directory that again has been configured to be shared via FTP. You can also use the FTP anonymous login module to actually check and see whether you can log into the FTP server anonymously without providing any credentials, and that's an equally important module. So that is going to be it in regards to the practical section and the lab environment. So let me just switch back to my slides. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at how to perform SMB enumeration. SMB is quite an important protocol to understand, and of course to learn how to perform enumeration on, so that you can discover various vulnerabilities. You can also discover the version of SMB that's running, as well as perform an SMB brute force attack. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at in the next video.